Hello and welcome to this installment of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Ghassan Moazin and I am an assistant professor here at the Institute, and I'm also joined today by my colleague John Wong, who is an associate professor here at the Institute. So today we're very happy to welcome to the webinar Dr. Thomas Larkin. Thomas got his BA and MA from York University and then went on to do a PhD in Bristol at the University of Bristol. And that PhD was on the history of Augustine Heard, which of course was a major American trading firm active in the 19th century in China and including Hong Kong. So it's of particular interest to us in Hong Kong here, of course. And Thomas now is an Augustine Heard Fellow at Bristol and is continuing his research. And that's also what he is going to talk to us about today. His talk is entitled, I Am Not Now That Which I Have Been, a global microhistory of Augustine Heard and Company. Now, before I hand things over to Thomas, I should say a few words about the format. So Thomas is going to talk for around half an hour, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions for Thomas, either during the talk or during the Q&A at any time, feel free to submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I'll read them out during the Q&A period, and Thomas can reply to you. But without taking up any more time, Thomas, if you're ready, please feel free to get started with your presentation.
Sure, thank you. Okay, we're good to go. Sorry, we'll scroll through all the slides. So thank you again, Ghassan and John, for sort of setting this up. It's much appreciated. I've been looking forward to it. As Ghassan says, I'm Augustine Heard Fellow at the University of Bristol now, which means, I work on Augustine Heard. But I'm also an affiliate of the Hong Kong History Project there, which you can find at hongkonghistory.net. And so we do some exciting things around sort of all of this and whatnot. So today, I'm gonna talk briefly about my research on the firm. So I wanted to kind of divide this talk into two halves. So for the first half, I wanted to give just a very sort of broad strokes general overview of the trajectory of Augustine Heard and Company. And then for the second half, I'm going to expand a little bit upon what it is I actually do with this case study, sort of in terms of Hong Kong history, in terms of global microhistory as a methodology and as a methodological framework, and then sort of the next steps that this research is moving into as I continue working with it and sort of playing around with it. So to get started, my research generally approaches the history of Americans in China through a microhistorical framework. I use the firm as a microhistorical launching point, and from which I set out to understand the roles that Americans played in expanding global empires in the 19th century. The research uses the profile of a single firm to reinsert Americans into the history of 19th century Sino-foreign contact and to really tease out the multiple ways that Americans made and were made by British colonial society and British imperial spaces. And so China, well, Hong Kong, the treaty ports really serve as the context with which to do this, but it's more sort of widely applicable to a colonial world. In doing so, I adopt sort of a novel and deliberate reading of a family company archive. So it's, in a sense, it's a little funny that I'm giving a talk to a business webinar about this, because this is effectively a history of a business or a history of a firm that isn't really a business history. So I shift focus away from business matters and commercial matters to question the ways that Americans engaged with colonial society and with Western imperialism in China. I look sort of specifically at the ways that Americans refine their national, racial, and cultural identity through contact with Chinese and British communities, and indeed through sort of othered communities, as they would have it generally. Lastly, this is a history that takes the story of Americans in China further into the 19th century than extant studies really do. So, I mean, the seminal works, so Jacques Downes and James Fichter, really sort of end at the end of the First Opium War. But by going sort of further into the late 19th century, into the 1880s, when these firms start to really dissolve en masse, we're able to trace a shifting mentality towards imperialism, China and the Chinese, that saw British and American interests increasingly align in sort of these imperial spaces, such as Hong Kong. As sort of John Carroll and Stephen Tufnell rightly pointed out when they reviewed this work for me, this is a study that, by nature of the archives, is limited to the experiences of an upper strata of white Americans in China. So when I say I study Americans in China, it's a little bit circumscribed at this point. I don't really have the scope in this particular study to go beyond to consider other communities or other sort of class levels of the American community. But the idea hopefully is that through doing this kind of work, it proves exemplary for how historians might continue to recognize the diverse ways that a multitude of actors either adapted to, exploited, or advanced and were shaped by British colonialism in China. So to dig into Augustine Heard Company, the company was founded in 1840 by Joseph Coolidge of Boston, Massachusetts, and Augustine Heard Sr. of Ipswich. Joseph Coolidge had been a promising young member of what would become known in the 1860s as the Boston Brahmins. So this was a term coined by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. To describe sort of this elite cohort of New England families that had advantageous social connections, lots and lots of generational wealth, were sort of comparable to a British aristocracy. And Joseph Coolidge was sort of emblematic of this status. So he was not independent, he was generationally wealthy, and he ended up marrying Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Wales Randolph, who he met in Monticello and then 2 weeks later proposed to. So from the right social pedigree and with sort of this advantageous marriage to his benefit, Coolidge managed to secure a partnership in the preeminent American merchant firm at Guangzhou, Russell & Company, where he served as a partner alongside the other prominent New Englanders, so the Forbes family, the Perkinsons, the Sturgises, and then sort of importantly, Augustine Heard Sr., who had once been sort of a very notable and well-reputed ship captain in supercargo, and by this point was now sort of a partner himself with Russell & Company. The firm traded out of Guangzhou's 13 factories, and as I mentioned, was sort of the preeminent American house in China. Most of its competition really couldn't hold a candle to it at this point. So the short version of how Augustine Heard Company comes to sort of fruition out of all of this is that Coolidge made himself incredibly obnoxious. So to start with, he sort of notably messed up a transaction on behalf of the leading Hong merchant Ho Kwa while he was in London. And then to sort of make matters worse, on top of messing up this transaction, he shared confidential information with outside parties about Ho Kwa's business, which he thought would sort of, help smooth out the tensions, but really obviously riled people. He then sort of made the self-damning move of notably and vocally opposing the appointment of the young American trader Robert Bennett Forbes as a partner to the firm in 1839. This was a particularly foolish thing to do because Robert Bennett Forbes had stronger family connections with the firm. So if it came down to sort of a battle between the two, Coolidge was definitely on the losing side of that. So through correspondence, we can tell that Coolidge was sort of fairly aware that he had made some fairly egregious missteps. So he suspected sort of what waited for him when he arrived back in China. And sure enough, in 1839, when he landed in Macau, he was met by Robert Bennett Forbes, who was now sort of, unanimously elected a partner, who informed him that he would no longer be required as a partner in the firm of Russell & Company. So suspecting this, Coolidge had been in talks with Heard, who was at this point in Boston, about sort of setting off on their own, and Heard had given sort of some implicit allowance or implicit support for this decision. So Coolidge then sets out to start his own firm, which he creatively titles Russell & Company, like the other Russell & Company, because he was, I presume, petty, I don't know. Yeah, the firm formed early January 1840, sought to bring in Nathaniel Kinsman as a partner who was working at Macau and in Canton at that time. And Nathaniel Kinsman sort of for whatever reason, gets cold feet, backs out, which prompts Augustine Heard Sr. to recommend bringing in George Basil Dixwell, who comes as a package deal with his brother John James Dixwell, who is sort of working as a financier in New York. So they get both as partners, but John James never actually ever comes out to China. He stays in New York and continues to do finances. The following year, Heard would bring in his nephew, John Heard, who would also become partner in time. And this would set a decade-long precedent whereby the Heard brothers, so Augustine Jr., Albert, and George, would all sort of apprentice at and then become partners in the firm, sort of really making it a family affair. The first successes of Augustine Heard Company came during the Opium War and the sort of opportunity provided by the instability of it. So the Chinese embargo against British traders provided Americans who had sort of remained on good and amicable terms with the Chinese with an opportunity to transship goods for the British and to smuggle opium. And sort of this notably helped the Heards out when Jardine Matheson approached Robert Bennett Forbes to see if Russell and Company would work as agents for Jardine Matheson and Company. And Forbes, having too much business as it was and possibly trying to repair ties, deferred Jardine Matheson and Company to Coolidge, which would set sort of a partnership between the two firms that would last most of its life. So this really gave the firm its first leg up in China. And in the years following the war, Augustine Heard Company would sort of expand to become commission agents for a range of goods. So, I mean, above board, tea, cotton were sort of notable, and then rice a little bit as well. But then below board, they obviously did a lot of business with opium, sort of first working as transshipment agents for Jardine Matheson and for Kesari-san Kushal-chand and Jamsetji Gigi Boy, but then sort of starting to trade in opium themselves as Dixwell learned the trade sort of gradually from Jardine Matheson and Company. They would also get involved as insurance agents, and from the 1860s, they would start to invest heavily in sort of solid infrastructure such as steam shipping along the China coast and up the Yangtze. There we go. Perfect. So Augustine Heard Company expanded fairly rapidly, taking advantage of Sino-British conflicts and the treaties that followed. And as well as America's own forays into sort of economic imperialism against Japan, to entrench their business throughout China, Japan, and the Philippines. So around 1846, they established their second branch in Shanghai. This was followed by a third one in 1854 in Fuzhou. And then with the sort of resolution of the Second Opium War, things really kicked off. First, they also, so their biggest move really for the company and its layout was the destruction of the 13 factories during the Second Opium War, so in about 1857, where the firm, instead of waiting to rebuild, I mean, they did eventually rebuild in Shamian, but before doing so, they moved their headquarters to Hong Kong with the rest of the sort of American community. Augustine Heard Sr. or Jr. had sort of anticipated I won't say the destruction of the 13 Hongs, but the crises in Guangzhou. And so he purchased a property for the firm to move into fairly quickly, sort of in Taiping-shan on the western limit of Victoria. And I've just lost my internet again, I think.
We can still hear you okay.
Okay, it's going all over. I get like a weird beeping in the background when it's about to go, so hopefully we're good. Anyway, so following the destruction of the 13 factories, they moved to Hong Kong. They set up in Taiping-shan on the western limit. And then about a year later, they moved to what is the sort of the iconic and recognizable Heard family property. So what you guys would now recognize as the former French mission building, which was then overlooking the parade grounds and has sort of ironically become an emblematic image of the British colony in that period. So this American house is really front and center in our images of British Hong Kong. So yeah, following the Second Opium War and a British victory, which the American partners had sort of at this point eagerly anticipated, the Heards expanded rapidly into the newly opened treaty ports. So around 1860, they established branches in Tianjin, Zhejiang, Hankou, and Amoy. They likewise spread to Japan, so their first branch was set up there in Kanagawa around 1861, and then branches followed in Yokohama in 1865 and Hyogo or Kobe in 1870. So in the course of building and maintaining this company, the brothers brought over 100 men to China, as well as employed sort of many Chinese Macanese individuals, who all sort of invariably became members of the treaty port networks that would link Hong Kong with the China coast in the interior via the Yangtze, and then as far as the new treaty ports opening up in Japan. The occupations of these Chinese Macanese and Anglo-Saxon employees covered a whole range of classes, from partners to clerks, tea tasters, captains, comforters, shroffs, amas, and then basically an army of domestic laborers. Some of the Americans that came alone. Some brought their families, although this was sort of a frowned upon process or practice. Men of talent were also poached from competing firms when opposite, while positions were found for underqualified cousins and distant relatives who sort of winked at systems of nepotism. By providing these opportunities, Augustine Heard Company and the other American firms like it helped establish the American community that would grow throughout China's treaty ports in the 19th century. And so they really helped entrench this. Their business likewise adapted to meet the growth of the firm, local trade becoming an increasingly important part of the way that they operated, as well as local shipping. And this shipping especially provided sort of the major opportunity, and one which Americans at the cutting edge of steam technology and innovation in the 1850s and 1860s were well poised to dominate in China. Lastly, their pursuit of elite status also led these Americans to participate in sort of a diverse range of administrative and commercial activities that helped contribute to the general character and development of the treaty ports and of Hong Kong. So they would serve on the Hong Kong Chamber of Commerce. They would get involved as shareholders for the board of HSBC. They'd be involved in philanthropic opportunities such as the merchants or the sailors' home. So really, they become active participants in colonial and treaty port life, or colonial and semi-colonial life, rather. Now, Augustine Heard Company was a relic of the old China trade, ultimately, and sort of this halcyon age of Sino-Western commerce. There were sort of accordingly certain images that firms like Augustine Heard Company and Russell & Company were expected to maintain if they were to preserve their prestige and the confidence of the wider community in Hong Kong and the treaty ports. So this is sort of evidenced, especially through a stream of articles in China Mail and China Punch that mock the high living of the merchant class, especially the pretensions of clerks who very often lived beyond their means and felt that they had to live beyond their means in order to sort of fit with the overall, merchant class. And this quotidian life that they lived was sort of characterized by its high level of comfort. So in the days of the old China trade, firms, British and American firms alike, were often associated with extravagance. In the Canton days, as many people have written about, they hosted sort of constant lavish dinner parties where bottles of wine, Madeira, pale ale, and port were all sort of imported at great expense and sort of accompanied every single place setting. Firms likewise took turns hosting each other, having balls, sort of throwing these lavish parties, and generally engaging in merrymaking. And then each employee down to the clerk had their own personal servant who was sort of, ubiquitously called boy. And then Augustine Heard Company alone, to give a sense of numbers, employed 51 servants in just one of their Hong Kong properties. So the spending wasn't really a concern. The Heard brothers especially outfitted their houses in a style that was really highly calibrated to demonstrate the success of their firm, and was incredibly expensive to maintain. And beyond this, they personally, as individuals, were avid collectors of curios from their travels around East Asia. In return, they imported sort of clothing, carpets, furnishings, and sundry items that were comfortable for them from New England. And then they also sort of, as a side interest, acquired as many chinneries as humanly possible, which is not a cheap hobby. This extravagance was sort of standard and sustainable in the first half of the century, but by the 1860s rather, sort of these changing business models, an American and Taiping Civil War unfolding at the same time, and a global economic crisis that was about to sort of sink most American capital, put incredible pressures on these large firms. So the Heards, to give one example of these pressures, had invested very heavily in steam in the 1860s. But most of the steamships that they had ordered and that Russell & Company had ordered were diverted because of the American Civil War and this very strong domestic U.S. demand. And so sort of both the capital opportunity of that and this patriotic sense that they should be contributing to the Union war effort. So by the time these ships are freed up from their conflict duties, and they reach China, Yangtze shipping has become saturated by sort of a whole range of firms. I guess, as Robert Bickers has written about them, Swire becomes sort of one of the major competitors, and pushes Heard and Russell and Company out. And they begin to face sort of increasingly able and increasingly sort of clever domestic competition. Now, these ships represented an enormous commitment in capital, and the only real market to offload them was Japan, where steamships were being sold to combatants for the Sino-Joy movement. But the civil conflicts in Japan had sort of ironically bankrupted all the buyers there as well. So it was very difficult to find buyers for ships. Ships lingered, they ate up capital, captains had to be paid, and in the meantime, they didn't turn any sort of profit. So this is just one example, but in general, the company struggled to keep pace with an influx of new traders and companies that possessed more agile business models and weren't tied down to sort of physical assets. Still, despite these difficulties, their high spending persisted, and Albert Heard, who was the leading partner by the 1870s, was sort of widely regarded as useless at business. Albert Heard continued to carry on as the firm had in the days when it had sort of enjoyed its peak success. And so while they partly blamed Albert for the firm's failure, both Augustine and John conceded that the environment in general in Hong Kong was such, or in China rather, was such that any sort of retrenchment would be a death knell for the company. As they saw it, in China, so much as appearing to fail was as good as actually failing. And a loss of confidence in customers and the wider community was a hard thing to climb back from. So Augustine Heard Company's decline was fairly apparent from about the 1860s, but the firm did manage to hold on until 1875 when it declared bankruptcy. So just prior to this, in about 1873, the youngest brother, George Heard, had left Hong Kong with ill health and sort of passed away en route, so in the Gulf of Aden, to America. After the bankruptcy, Albert Heard obviously follows him, and then the following year, John Heard and Augustine Heard, who were both sort of already in Boston and Paris respectively, living sort of a semi-retired life, returned to Hong Kong and made a rather anemic attempt to resurrect the company under the new name Heard & Co., so dropped the Augustine. This lasted less than a year, and by 1876, basically all semblances of the company were gone, save for an ongoing bankruptcy proceeding that would persist into the 1880s that was overseen by Jardine Matheson and Company. So despite their failure, this is really a narrative of a firm that was thoroughly interwoven into treaty port and colonial society. And my research has largely been concerned with using this firm and the writings of its partners to trace the ways that Americans contributed to the making of such society, and then were in turn shaped by their experiences sort of trading in China and participating actively in British Empire. So the example of Hong Kong especially provides a very effective case study of this. So, I mean, on one hand, we can actually physically map the imprint of the firm upon the colony. So, I mean, the map that I've got here doesn't look like much, but it geotags using GIS methods every single one of the Heard's properties. And then these can be overlaid over sort of, a progressing array of maps to show sort of how the colony has grown around the buildings that the Heards established and built. And so most of them have been torn down, but there are physical legacies that do persist. So in Wan Chai, we still have Heard Street sort of over by the corner here. And then Inland Lot 82 is still the former French Mission building, which is, I believe, just undergone sort of a fairly substantial refurbishment. So there are still physical legacies of the firm present. But in a sort of a more abstract sense, the letters also provide a detailed account of the ways that Americans integrated with the wider colonial community and the competing ease or reluctance with which they did so, as well as sort of a gradual development amongst Americans abroad of sort of a sympathetic stance towards British Empire. Now, this is especially significant because prior to the Second Opium War and their shift from Guangzhou to Hong Kong, Americans had been sort of vocally wary of empire. Their benevolent Republican identity was sort of at odds with British militancy, and they were fairly sympathetic towards the Chinese in their struggles against the British, sort of on the grounds of supporting sovereign rights, which were, fundamental to the American ideal. Still, they operated through a form of what we're sort of terming symbiotic trend imperialism, where they basically used the trappings of empire, the systems of empire, and contributed to the systems of empire to maintain or work with the same benefits that imperial actors such as the British actually had. This was especially evident in Hong Kong, where within the context of the Second Opium War, these Americans couldn't help in a sentiment that was expressed by John Heard, siding with those that they were living with, by which John meant the British. Americans in China, sort of from this period onwards, gradually came to appreciate the crude efficacy of British belligerence in China, and their desire to secure the same concessions from the Chinese and see China opened helped sort of align these two communities. And then on the other hand, they were sort of increasingly wary, especially due to colonial panics such as the 1857 Poison Panic or the massacre aboard the Thistle, of a Chinese community that they came to conceive as sort of an oppositional enemy. Now, both these processes sort of contributed to a racializing of a Chinese other, which in turn supported a consolidation of a unifying sort of white identity that bound the British and the American communities. And then this whiteness, this white identity, was further strengthened through shared claims between New Englanders and British individuals to sort of this Anglo-Saxon heritage, this cultural heritage. So Americans such as the Heards thus increasingly participated in the pomp and circumstance of of elite British society. They joined the Hong Kong Club. They put up their own Faki Club or Faki Cup at the annual races. They competed against the British in cricket, rowing, and regattas, and they participated in sort of the gamut of visiting, hosting, dining, and balls. So I think Albert Heard in his writing sort of recorded almost every day of the week going to some other event. They likewise celebrated ceremonies like Victoria's birthday with sort of gusto. Then there are some pretty great pictures on historical photographs of China of Russell and Company's Shanghai building all decked out and sort of bunting and whatnot for the Queen. And then they invited the British to do the same with the 4th of July. So this participation wasn't without tension. There were still sort of cultural incongruities that divided the communities, so along class lines or religious lines, or based on sort of mutually prepossessed pretensions about each other's, politics or culture. But generally, American merchants helped consolidate a multinational elite colonial culture that was rather unique to port cities such as Hong Kong or Shanghai. So it's a fairly complicated thing, approaching a global history from the perspective of a single firm. It requires a sensitivity to transnational and trans-imperial circumstances that shaped the ways that these various communities interacted. And most importantly, it requires an awareness not only of the interconnections that existed, but also of the disconnections between sort of, these transnational spaces. So a decent example of the latter would be the apathy that the Anglo-American community generally felt towards U.S.-British tensions in the Atlantic during the American Civil War. I mean, this was something that was a huge media storm in the Atlantic theater, but that individual merchants in China registered having absolutely no interest in because it threatened the social cohesion there. But so my research has accordingly pioneered a multi-scalar framework that progresses in scope from micro to global, and then chronologically from the firm's founding to the sort of afterlives, as it were, of their partners who had returned to the US. Each chapter of the monograph takes a different scale while preserving this overall narrative arch. So the first adopts a purely micro-historical analysis of the firm's founding partners. So it looks at George Dixwell and Joseph Coolidge and the ways that each represents the sort of varied ways that Americans interacted with the wider British and Chinese community in Guangzhou. The second uses the transition to Hong Kong to consider the domestic space and the private lives of Americans in colonial society. The third expands the scope to the public to account for the ways that Americans engaged with the wider community. The fourth broadens to a regional and interregional focus, which considers the transnational changes that occurred sort of in commerce. And how global conflicts in the 60s reshaped the trading environment in China. The fifth draws upon innovative digital humanities methods and quantitative research and social network analyses to map the extent of American travel and the global networks that they formed while living and trading between China and the West. And then the final serves sort of as a brief epilogue, which returns to New England to consider the ways that these Americans that had left China sort of following the 1880s and the general bankruptcies were shaped in their domestic lives by their transnational experiences. So working from micro to macro affords the potential really to reassess what aspects of global or the global historical context were actually relevant to Americans on the ground and what forces shaped their lives, as well as what forces failed to. So it allows us to sort of tease out some of the preconceptions we have about global history. And it's largely supported by a wide engagement with primary materials and multiple approaches to sort of reading a source. So it varies from line-by-line textual analysis to newspaper and almanac surveying to methods as sort of broad as quantitative data extraction and text mining. And so the result has really been a study that is global in scope and engages with all the complexity that such a global history would entail, but is sort of still bound by a single coherent narrative thread. So looking forward, the next steps of this project include obviously, publishing this finished monograph, which is currently being revised, but then also launching this related initiative that we're working on, which has been inspired by digital humanities methods that were employed for the 5th chapter. So this digital project, which I've just secured seed funding for, comprises a searchable database of foreign and Chinese individuals that participated in the 19th century China trade. And the data will likewise support a digital platform that is intended for sort of both pedagogical and research applications, which will hopefully allow academic students and the public to visualize effectively the global networks and mobility of those engaged in the China trade and how such networks grew or shrunk over time. The project uses text mining, GIS, and social network analysis methods to catalog and track the movements of every named individual that we come across in the archive, and to trace the commercial and social links that they built and maintained with the wider community. And so, I mean, for terms of my sanity, we're starting this project with the Heard Archive specifically. So that's, our center point. But it's sort of fairly reasonable to expect that this project is going to expand to incorporate a very broad range of materials and up to about 20,000 individual actors by using materials such as almanacs, treaty port directories, private letters and newspapers, and archives such as the Massachusetts Historical Society. And so while it seemingly sort of departs from the microhistorical focus of the monograph project and the research into Augustine Heard and my research into Augustine Heard Company, this project is meant to help sort of demonstrate the qualitative applications of quantitative databasing. So the digital project has further been inspired by my work on the Heards largely, and by my own personal attempts to grapple with sort of this problem of how we might better represent the extent to which 19th century individuals interacted with a global environment in which space and time was becoming sort of increasingly compressed through technological and systemic innovations such as imperial expansion, steam and railway infrastructure, the telegraph system, systems of credit, and ideas of extraterritoriality. So both projects stem at their base from this recognition of the current limitations in global historical research and what we as historians can potentially do through creative readings of company archives to rectify these limitations. So as my research has set out to argue, an entire generation of American traders were shaped by their experiences living in Hong Kong and trading in the Qing Empire. There, they made and lost fortunes, participated in the unfolding of Chinese history, left their mark on China, and in turn, ended the treaty ports in Hong Kong as a colony, and in turn helped knit China and the US together through transnational systems of migration and commerce. As individuals, they benefited from the interchange and in the process became active participants in the British Empire, while firming up the social and cultural identity of Hong Kong's Western community. Looking back over his life trading in China, John Heard concluded his 1891 autobiography with Lord Byron's words, "What is writ, would it were worthier." He felt disappointed in retrospect that his life had seemed to contain much more incident than when brought to the test of analysis, and that it appeared poor and meager when put to paper. The entirety of the quote might perhaps have been a better indicator of the extent to which he and his countrymen had been changed by their experiences. What is writ, would it were worthier, but I am not now that which I have been. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas, for giving us this wonderful overview of your project. I'm particularly fascinated by the network analysis bit, so that looks really great. So now, as I said, we have some time for questions. So if you have any questions for Dr. Larkin, please just submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I'll read them out. We already have our first question, actually. from Jedediah Cronky, our colleague here at HKU, and he says, Eileen Scully now classically portrayed the overseas American community as a diplomatic image problem to be managed. How much did you see the company and its members as projecting a particular image stateside? Was there a disconnect or difference between their overseas and stateside representation of their work, especially as you outline their practical mutualism with British Empire? Given the growing relevancy, I guess, of the US missionary movement in American presence as the 19th century progressed, was maintaining a relationship with missionaries a clear part of their business practice, either socially or in their actual logistics? What were the underlying differences in their business models with those new ones that relied less on physical capital? So quite a few questions. I don't know what you can probably see what you want to bite off first of that, or how you want to get back to Jed.
I'm happy to touch on all of them. Thank you, Jedediah. Yeah, it's so three questions really at its base, right? So as far as sort of Eileen Scully's work and the image of the U.S. merchants abroad, I mean, Eileen Scully really focuses on this idea of extraterritoriality, right? And I mean, this is the prime enabler for these Americans abroad. Is they're sort of almost working through sort of like the man on the spot trope, where these merchants are rather, I mean, because of a disconnection in space and time, they're disconnected from the Central American administration, and they have private interests that don't really cohere to American policy, especially as they start to get sort of more embroiled in British imperialism. So there's not the greatest image of them stateside. There's not a whole lot of interest in China questions in the American government. And I mean, this is sort of evidenced through the extent to which Americans in China lobbied for, for military support, for financial support. And this lobbying often fell sort of on deaf ears. But so they were engaged in a practice of doing whatever it was they really wanted to do to support their business. And then the American government playing catch up and sort of trying to, put out fires. And this is something that changes drastically after the 1880s. I mean, the American community that I talk about sort of stops being a thing from sort of the 1880s, and then is replaced by a new cohort with, professionally trained diplomats and consuls that is much more engaged in a formal sort of relationship with China. As for the U.S. missionary movement, it's obviously incredibly relevant, but it's not terribly relevant to American merchants. I mean, with the exception of maybe Oliphant and Co., most American merchants have a fairly poor opinion of missionaries. They see them as sort of parasitic. They see them as obnoxious, and they don't really interact with them. I mean, it's to the extent that I've done a paper on Amoy where the American consul never actually wrote about any interactions with the fairly successful U.S. missionary movement in Xiamen. So they're not really, there isn't a lot of social or commercial overlap with what missionaries are doing, at least at this period. And then as far as the underlying differences in business models with new ones that relied less on physical capital, it comes down to brokerage. So I mean, these firms, when they started out, they did tend to be sort of, commission agents. They worked sort of through other people's capital to conduct trade. And then for whatever reason, they decided to get into these solid forms of capital through steamships and land ownership. So becoming sort of landlords is a fairly big thing, like the Heard's own tenements in Hong Kong that they rented out to Chinese occupiers and whatnot. But this was something that was actually fairly, in the Heard's case, fairly frowned upon by their founding members. So Augustine Heard Sr. constantly cautioned his son or nephews not to invest in solid capital because it was a foolish thing to do. But I mean, the lure of the Yangtze was a huge thing for Americans in the 1860s, and so most of them did really get involved in steamshipping. And then when the market crashed, they couldn't survive, but people that were engaged in just, doing brokerage trade were the ones that tended to survive. And they were smaller businesses, smaller models. A broker could act independently or with like a partner. And I mean, typically be much more flexible with the way that the global market was going in the 1870s. So hopefully that covers all of your questions.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from our colleague Gina Marchetti, and she asks, or she says, thank you for this interesting presentation. And she asks, I'm curious about the role of women play in this story. For example, you mentioned the importance of marriage into the Jefferson family. But I wonder about whether wives accompanied their men to China and what role they did play, or what role did they play?
Yeah, thank you, Gina. So they play an incredibly important role. I mean, I mentioned I hinted that families were frowned upon, but I mean, this is something that also changed over time. So by the 60s and 70s, Hong Kong was considered a much more civil place to bring your family and your children, even if some of these women didn't really, appreciate being dragged out to China. But they play a very large part in my research, especially. So in my second and third chapters that look sort of specifically at domestic life and then public life, women are sort of the prime drivers of social interactions, and social interaction is then sort of in turn a prime driver of commerce. So really, these women are sustaining the social life upon which commerce is built. So I mean, a good wife is considered sort of an incredibly important asset. It's also useful because in the case of American women, we actually do get quite a few records that are in their voice. So we get to see the ways that they feel about sort of their lives in China, about interacting with the British community. We get to see the way that they build tropes and assumptions about the Chinese. We have sort of fairly complete documentary profiles of the experiences that they had. And so it's interesting work. It's one that, I mean, I could admittedly engage a little bit more with, and that's something that the Digital Humanities Project is trying to work around. But it's also something that Stacey Lee Ford is doing quite well, and I'm happy to take the lead from her on this because she is sort of really the expert on it. But anyway, in short, the point is women are there. Women are an incredibly important resource, and women are also sort of integral to the way that commerce unfolds.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Professor Zhang Ning of the Academia Sinica, and she says, she just wants to know a bit more about how digital humanities has helped this project so far. So I wonder whether you maybe want to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah. So basically the impetus for it was during sort of my drafting of the 5th chapter. I was really struggling with this idea of how to articulate the extent of the global networks that the Herds were engaging with. I mean, they had something like, as I found it, and I'm nowhere near complete in building this database, but at the time I had mapped something like 498 social connections between China and the US that they maintained while doing this trade. And it's a very hard thing to sort of communicate through, a standard, dissertation, monograph, journal article. And so digital humanities provided a sort of a quantitative solution to this, that from which qualitative questions could be sort of answered. So it gave us a sense of the scope, it gave us a sense of their travels. So the map that I showed you sort of back, not the map with the GIS locations, but the map of their travels over, it gives a sense of which sort of cities were central nodes to the herds. So I mean, Paris figures quite prominently in the China trade because of the way the transnational networks and movements worked. So digital methods have really given us a tool to work with to better articulate the extent of these networks and how they were maintained and sort of what their overall structure was. So I like a lot of my digital networking measures metrics like nationality, race, to see sort of the general profiles of the communities that the herds were forming. And I mean, in the future, we're working with an increasingly sort of sophisticated set of tools. So I mean, the Elites Networks and Power in China group at IMRSI has just sort of launched their HisText program, which allows us to do massive data mining of both Chinese and English sources. And we're going to be using that quite heavily going forward to sort of put these networks together. But so it's fairly integral to the way that the questions for this project are framed, even if the questions are sort of inherently microhistorical.
Yeah, thank you. Next question comes from the Huang, and the question or comment is, thank you for your presentation. Were the herds involved in any way with the California trade? And also you mentioned that developing a racialized view of Chinese was a process. So were US domestic debates about Chinese exclusion a contributing factor, or mainly their own experience and interests in China?
Absolutely. Thank you, Didi. That's the last one's a question I've actually gotten like 3 times in the last 2 weeks. So you're definitely on the right track. So there was some involvement in the China trade, in the California trade. Their shipping did go that way. So I mean, Thomas Layton has done some some work on sort of the Frolic and other ships that they sent that way. The herds themselves didn't really go through California too often. I think I only actually have a reference of John Heard's wife, Mary, traveling that way. And it's really the way that global sort of commercial infrastructure was built up at this time. So, I mean, if you're a New England merchant, your capital is based in Baring Brothers in London, and you've got sort of other financial connections in Paris on the way. And so your travels and your general sort of direction of trade is really geared over towards the Atlantic and then down sort of through the Suez. And so the way that business unfolds, the way that sort of trying to operate a multinational business in the age of letters and steam really draws American merchants towards the Atlantic. But as far as trade is concerned, and as far as Chinese migration, as you point out, the Pacific becomes a much more important node, especially once the railway is completed, linking sort of east and west in the U.S. So it's an important part of their commerce, which, as I said, is something that my research is a little bit unfortunately weakened. But it's definitely something that's worth teasing out, is the way these California connections were drawn. And it's also, to go back to that digital humanities point, it's a very hard thing to physically articulate their connection between sort of the West Coast and China, because there weren't as many stopping points between that traveling route. So it's harder to trace their movements. As far as developing a racialized view of the Chinese, this is the question that I'm getting quite a bit right now. In short, you don't actually see very much in American letters about Chinese exclusion. I mean, every so often they talk about it with sort of the trade in Chinese indentured laborers or migration. But Americans, up until sort of later in the period, so around the 1880s, 1890s, that were trading in China, don't really talk from Hong Kong about Chinese exclusion or about Chinese migration that much. It does become a much more important question to them once they return to America, and they're trying to sort of revise US interest in China. And then they sort of unexpectedly become advocates of a more deracialized view of the Chinese. So they tend to, I don't want to say that these men were sort of benevolent or philanthropic or progressive in ways that they weren't, but they become very involved in sort of supporting Chinese migration and supporting increased trade and political links between the US and China. And so this is something that I want to work with a bit further. The chapter that looks at these returned American merchants to New England is not something that I've actually fully fleshed out yet. It's the one that's still sort of really being constructed. But I mean, as your question and as the question of sort of your colleagues has prompted, it's a very important part of that debate. It's something that I've definitely got to take more into account.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from James Victor. And he says, you at various points in your talk framed the firm as quote unquote preeminent, but also seem to be interested in not taking that image on wholesale sans critique. Could you clarify how you see their social role being perceived by elites in British colonial circles on the China coast and in Hong Kong? Were they ever really co-equals or really always beneath the Brits in British eyes in China? What distinct commercial roles did Americans play, if any, vis-a-vis the British? And how might that differ from the roles other communities played in treaty ports, French, Japanese, Indians, Russians, etc.? And in what way might we say there was or was not an international expatriate community akin perhaps to the international community in Suez by the 1880s, 1890s? Or is it a special relationship between Britons and Americans in China?
So thank you, James. I'm going to actually sort of start backwards on that one. I'm reluctant to call it a special relationship because sort of, as you point out, I haven't actually been able to do much work with the wider sort of foreign community. So the French, the Japanese, the Indians, the Russians, etc. So, I mean, my impulse would just say that based on sort of this latent belief in Anglo-Saxonism, the commonalities of English speaking, that there was possibly more cohesion between the two communities, but I can't really qualify that at this point. So I'd be reluctant to try. But it's really work that I'm hoping that we see more. I mean, there's been a bit of work in the Swedish community trading in Canton that's been really, really interesting of late. And I'm hoping that people continue to sort of expand on this type of research. As for sort of preeminent, or I mean, second most preeminent is maybe probably more likely the appropriate. I mean, amongst the American community, obviously, they're not really competing with Jardine Matheson and Company, or Dent and Company. I mean, the Heards constantly complain that Dent and Company beats them to treaty ports such as Hong Kong. So they like to see themselves as the greatest, but the greatest amongst the Americans. So they're even careful to hedge that in the way that they write about themselves. As far as their social role, I mean, it's a hard thing to sort of qualify social attitudes when you're working with letters that are very sort of opinionated. But I get the sense from the way that they write that they are always sort of wary or self-conscious that they may not be necessarily seen as, top tier elite by the British. But this is also partly because we have a fundamental difference in what it means to be part of the elite class, right? So, I mean, Hong Kong is mostly a merchant elite, but there are still pretensions about what it means to be sort of a social elite in England, in Britain, that don't necessarily align with what Americans think it means to be elite. So, I mean, despite their spending, these Americans still seem to, consider themselves to be frugal, hardworking, honest Protestants. And this is often sort of at odds with the British community. As far as were they ever really co-equals, I wouldn't say that they necessarily were. Americans, I mean, they're the second most prominent foreign community in China, but this is like they're still at second most prominent Western community might be the better way to put it. But they're still like at a stark minority compared to the British. They're still sort of interlopers in British social space, and so they're trying to carve out a spot for themselves, and they're participating in a British colony on British terms and through British modes. But I would be reluctant to say that they're ever truly co-equals in terms of sort of society. I mean, they're certainly not represented the same way, either through philanthropic associations or through, like the club or whatnot. As for distinct commercial roles vis-a-vis the British, the Americans are, I think, much more involved in sort of opium from an intermediary role. So they don't tend to, at least until sort of the 60s, get involved in selling opium themselves. They're much more interested in earning brokerage fees on it and earning demurrage, in transshipping it for the British. So that's one sense. I mean, you do see Heard and Company sort of stepping on Jardine Matheson's toes and trying to set up like clandestine agreements with Jamsit Gigi Boy through Kesselsen Kutelschund. But I don't think that this actually ever goes anywhere. The Americans also get very involved in sort of special contracts with the Chinese. So the Heards had an ill-fated attempt to sell like massive amounts of rice to the Qing Empire, which never really came to much. But they're trying to diversify. They're trying to find ways around the British because, again, they're competing with large British firms that tend to be much more successful. And I mean, even in shipping, like the coastal trade is really where their shipping takes off because there's no way that they're ever going to hold a candle to P&O. So they're working within niches, I think. So hopefully that's satisfactory.
All right, thanks. I want to get to a comment and a question from our colleague Elizabeth Zinn. And she first says, actually, Augustine Heard & Co. had a lot to do with the California trade, I think as shipping agents, and she amends it later, for ships from Hong Kong sending cargo and Chinese passengers to California. So that's one comment from her. And then she also says, while bringing wives out east was important, many foreign men did start families in Hong Kong with protected women. Would you know how many American traders in Hong Kong did that? Charles Bosman, a Dutchman who came via California, started a family that generated Ho Tung and his siblings. So we have both the comment and the question. So yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I hadn't meant to your first comment. I hadn't meant to imply that they have no connection with the Pacific trade. I mean, they obviously do, as you say. It's just in the way that we've looked at the organization of their business, it's not something that figures as much in their personal letters. But it is absolutely important, as you say, especially sort of as shipping agents, as chartering out ships for Chinese charters. Also, they get involved sort of following abolition. They get really heavily invested in talking to individuals about the possibility of shipping out Chinese labor, which I see, your amended comment notes that as well. As for the protected women, this is actually one of the most exciting things that we've been able to do with the Heard Archive is we've been able to find a little bit of information. I mean, as you know, it's always a hard thing finding concrete information on these women in a colonial archive, especially where the relationships are supposed to be discreet. But we've been able to find a little bit of information about John Heard's protected woman and about his brother Augustine Heard's protected woman. And so what we're doing with that currently, what we're still trying to do with that is figure out sort of the ways that not only they sort of sought to maintain these women and look after their children through sort of stipends and through helping with like advantageous marriages and things like that, but also the ways that the capital that they provided these women then gave those women spending power to sort of, assert their position within the colony. So John Heard's protected woman becomes a landowner, as I think a few did. And it's a fairly widely accepted practice. I think Rachel Van deals with this a little bit better than I do, obviously. And so there are some people doing some really good work on it. But in the case of doing a microhistory on the Heards, the only ones I really have to work with are John Heard's and his children by that woman, Augustine Heard's, and then to an extent, Charles or Joseph Dixwell's Hosie. I can't quite remember what her actual name is, just her pseudonym, and her son Charles Sargent, who then becomes a migrant to the American East Coast. So in partners, at least, we already see it across 3 of 5 partners that made up Augustine Heard Company. And to go back to the I think it was the earlier comment, was it Dee Dee's about gender and women coming out. That was sort of another incentive to bring women out east, was it sort of hedged the possibility of these relationships that would then have to be masked and covered by partners in China. So it's an interesting conversation. It's one that I'm still working on, but you only ever find sort of really oblique references to these women and their children in the archive.
Yeah, thank you. The next question comes from Stephen Tennant, and he just has a question about, he says, fascinating. I see that you are Augustine Heard Fellow at the University of Bristol. So whether there's any, he asked whether there's any connection between the Heards and Bristol.
So not explicitly, but so this project is, and I should include this as a thank you. I believe he's here today. This project is funded sort of generously by George Cotherley, who has sort of a personal interest in seeing what can be done with the Heards. And so he had organized a studentship during my PhD to sort of do more research with their archive and to see what we could do sort of using this archive to look more at the American community in China. And so that's been sort of the impetus for it. And it just, by a happy accident, the Heards tended to be a very engaging story that a lot can be done with. So we've stuck really close to the Heards themselves. But the goal was really to look more at the American community writ large, which is what we're trying to do. And so the fellowship, the current research fellowship, is an extension of that, where we're trying to sort of, take this research a little bit further and see how we can really play around with it. So it's affiliated with the Hong Kong History Project broadly, is I think probably the best way to put it.
Sure, thanks. Yeah. We have one more question from Wang Mingzi, and the question is, thank you for your impressive presentation. Considering the wide range of archives, as you mentioned that there were over 2,500 people who interacted in the network surrounding the company, how did you investigate the archives and retrospect the multiple social interactions?
Yeah, it's a very hard question. There's 2 separate ways that I've set about to do it, and we're sort of in the process of revising the methodology for the quantitative database, because it obviously needs to be a bit more elegant and efficient. But basically what we did, I'll use the 498 that I actually have documented as an example, is we every time there was sort of a measurable connection between 2 individuals, we considered it to be a social relationship or a commercial relationship, and we tried to qualify that the best that we could. But we didn't really dig too much into it. So if I met someone in the street and had a coffee with them, and we decided that we were going to ship some tea together, that's, even if we never spoke to each other again, that's a relationship right off the bat. That's a network that was formed. So we basically worked on that basic level and traced those. But then what we've also been able to do is, through sort of social network analysis, you're able to line up attributes between individuals and trace the strength of connections within these communities and find various ways to qualify those. And so when you run this data through algorithms, you can actually see the graph form around sort of stronger networks and stronger, tighter networks. And so we've then worked with those tighter networks to sort of double confirm whether or not they were actually relevant. And then that's when we trace them up through qualitative research. So if we find that the herds have sort of an unexpected amount of connections to, like hypothetically, the sassoons, then that's a relationship that we're going to obviously dig into more through qualitative research. So instead of just trying to trace up every single relationship and qualify it and figure it out, we're trying to focus on the ones that do seem to have a discernible impact when we map the networks out. So it's kind of working backwards as a way of determining what is worth going microhistorically into.
Yeah, thank you.
Thomas, let me jump in with a question here. I am particularly intrigued by your reference to the white identity, and I think some of the questions already alluded to that, James and Elizabeth's, to just appreciate how that functioned in the context of Hong Kong. There is certainly something special, especially if you look at the Hertz participation in HSBC. It's not just the Hertz, it's also other Americans, other Russell and Company alum. And then HSBC ended up hosting for a while the American Consulate General's office in the headquarters. So there's certainly something particular about that relationship. But I wonder how that relegates other Caucasian identities to the lower echelons of the hierarchy in Hong Kong, and wonder if you have something that you're working on in your biographical database, the social network analysis, that would help us appreciate that, especially if you can track the other groups, the French, the Portuguese, or the Macanese, and perhaps by religious identities as well, affiliations. I think that would tell us a lot about early colonial Hong Kong.
Absolutely. And it's, so I've done a little bit of work on this. So my first research was into sort of, indigent whites and treaty ports who got stuck there. And so it did look a little bit about how groups like the Irish, for instance, never really had a solid claim to the white identity that, unified the upper strata. But really, Kathy Lads is working on that right now, and she's doing some really interesting stuff with it. And then, it's for a later period, obviously, but Robert Bicker's his putting the kibosh on the Kaiser book, that really short Penguin one. That kind of does dig into this question a bit, because when he's talking about the Anglo-German relations and how they're upset by the war in Europe, again, you get this sense of whiteness that is, unifying. They're neighbors, they're peers, they're white, they're all Western, they're all European, and this is sort of prompting a more careful or a more measured view of foreign tensions, right? These communities they're kind of working together with their friends, the Germans, to not be quite as sort of swayed by international politics. So in Robert's case, I think he draws it beyond the Anglosphere to look at the way that these communities interact. I'm obviously interested in reading wider around it, but it's not something that I've been able to do with my research so much at this stage. But as far as lower class whites, I think that's something that definitely has some merit, because we also, I talk about white Americans, but we don't really talk about, other Americans that come out either. And that's, I think, an important conversation that needs to be sort of explored a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. We have one more comment from James, or a question rather, and he says, did the Herds maintain important presences in other colonial ports outside of China?
Possibly not colonial, more likely, semi-colonial, if we want to use this sort of tricky term. So they're not doing too much. They had some work that they did through Calcutta, but I don't know that they ever actually really maintained a sustained presence there. It was more a place that they stopped and did some business in on the way home or on the way to China. They have connections in Singapore as well, but it's not sort of a sustained presence. I mean, if you want to call the ports in Japan colonial, like Kobe definitely has a colonial feel at this time, especially the way that it's built up and the foreign port is built up. But I wouldn't know that they had an important presence in what we'd consider formal colonial ports. I mean, the Heards certainly don't talk about it very much, if they do.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I'm cognizant of time, but if I could ask one final question. So what I am particularly interested in was this like extravagance that you talked about, and the fact that was sort of seen as you had to kind of project that in order to project also the health of your business. But I was wondering whether, I mean, that kind of ties in with what John asked as well, whether this has anything to do with the Americans wanting to do it like the British, because so I work on German bankers and late 19th, early 20th century, but when that generation of Germans sort of goes up to China, they look up upon this extravagance sort of as something rather negative and something they want to avoid. So I'm wondering, because they say, well, it's bad for business. So I'm sort of wondering, do any of the Americans, I mean, is there this feeling that they do it in order to kind of step it up and do it similar to the Brits? And is there anyone ever that has the idea, well, maybe we should just not do that and save a lot of money that way and get some kind of advantage over our competitors? Because that seems to be what, I mean, whether the Germans did it in the end or not, that is certainly not in all cases, but that seems to be the idea behind it as well. When I read the German sources, that, it's like, if you want to run a business, then that's what you don't do. You just keep costs low, basically.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's some inherent tensions in there to begin with. So, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, by the late 19th century, this is obviously a business model that's broken. I mean, you can't afford to live in the style of these old firms and still conduct trade in China. It's just not going to work. And I think in the case of the work that's been done on Spire and Co., that's probably why they were so successful to begin with, is because they were so much more crafty and frugal than their competitors, and used that to really squeeze into spaces. But I think it was just a hard thing for the old firms to let go of, right? I mean, this is the way that they had conducted business for, in some cases, almost a century by the 70s. And it's a hard thing to tell your partners that have come out to China to, earn a competency by the age of 30, go home and retire, that they can't, have a bottle of Madeira every single night. I mean, people want their wine. But it's where the inherent tension also comes through is that you've got, people in the States, especially, who are critiquing their countrymen for living these high lifestyles. So newspapers are making fun of them. I mean, Punch starts to take the piss out of the Heards quite heavily by the late 1870s for just being far too lush in the way that they're living their lives. And then, I mean, to go back to that question of women, the women that come out to China are also quite derisive of the high style that clerks try to live in. They find it to be just like absurd. So it definitely starts to lose social grace towards the end of this period. It's not something that I think that the partners are able really to let go of. So, I mean, as you say with the Germans, it's not a straightforward answer. It's very there's a lot of inherent tension to it.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much.
And sorry, to James's question very quickly. Yes, it
sure.
Absolutely is also antiquated to new arrivals from the U.S. They see their countrymen. A lot of them talk about how their countrymen have gone British, and now think that they're all little princes or whatever.
Yeah. Thank you for seeing that and seeing that last question. I'm cognizant of time, and I think we've already taken up a lot of your time. So what remains for me is to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about your wonderful research. I'm sure we're all looking forward to see where the project goes in the future and to learn more about it, and also for patiently answering all of our questions. So thank you very much for that. Before I let everyone go, I should mention that the next webinar will take place on the 6th of May, where we will have Yingjia Tan from Wesleyan University talk to us about his new book about electrification in modern China, and we'll advertise that as usual on social media and the email list, so keep an eye out for that, please. But yeah, once again, Thomas, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. It was a real pleasure to learn about your work.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Looking forward to welcoming you back to Hong Kong.
Indeed,
Yeah,
yes.
hopefully one day soon.
Let's all hope that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye to everyone.